Now it's time for our Smokin Bulls Smokin' Topic of the Day. We're here with Dr. Mikolaj Raszek to talk about vaccines. Right now, there's been a number of vaccines that have been approved by countries around the world, Canada included, and they're starting to roll out in different fashions. And that's our smoking topic today. We wanted to get your input on the vaccines, Dr. Raszek, and hear what you think about the current climate around the vaccination programs and the vaccines themselves.
So let me preface that as to why that is a good question for me. And the reason why is because I'm deeply interested in these new technology of mRNA vaccination. The reason why, and when we're talking about vaccines for COVID-19, there's a variety, there's a plethora of vaccines out there. My personal interest is the new ones, the first ones that came out in the Western world are the mRNA vaccines. Why am I so interested in that technology? Is because if it works well, and we prove it all works well, it introduces completely new medical advance for us to use, which is basically ability to manipulate how your genetics are used. So this is not manipulating your DNA, but the way you have to think of your DNA is that the DNA is a repository of information, like a filing cabinet, and then you go into that filing cabinet and you pull out a sheet. That's called RNA. And that RNA, that sheet is blueprint. So it's a little blue sheet that tells the body how to build a specific tiny little robot inside your cell. And that's RNA. And then from there, you go and you build the little robot, and then the little robot does certain function inside the cell in concert with thousands of other little robots. And together that behavior creates what ends up being a living cell. And then it's extended to your entire organism. So that's how it normally works inside the cell. And we hijacking that process with these mRNA vaccines, because what we're doing is we're packaging one of those blueprints, the little sheets of paper telling how to build a little robot. We're packaging that in like a little fat molecule in a little fat ball. It's inside there. And these little fat balls are absorbed by our cells, liver cells. And then these liver cells will use the RNA to create what I call a little robot. Now, in this case, that little robot will be foreign to us, and that's the spike protein that is normally present on the surface of the virus. So we're telling ourselves, build that same protein that is present on the surface of the virus. The cells will build that protein, and then they put it outwards on the surface of the cell, or they will excrete it. And that's when your immune system is triggered because it's seeing, oh, this is foreign. This is not normal. So basically, when you take the vaccine for a transient period of time, you fool certain number of your cells to look kind of like a virus on its surface, just with that one particular protein. It's called spike protein. That's how we activate our immune system, so that eventually when the actual virus enters your system, we already have immune system to recognize that spike protein because we trained our system for that. So why is this of interest to me is because we could do that with any genetic information. So once we have the complete grasp of how is genome utilized within different organs, within different cells, we will be able to modulate it at will. And in theory, sky is the limit as to what we'll be able to do with that. So an example that I like to provide that really gets people going and thinking, imagine if we were able to do that, mimic what we're doing with vaccines, but instead of having information for spike protein, we have number of different information that together, if it's injected in your body, it tells your body what to do. And as a consequence, we're reversing aging, or we're slowing down aging. You see my point, what I'm trying to get here, as to how we can now potentially increase advance of medicine with this technology. So that's why I'm very much interested in this. And therefore, I study whatever information I can find about this technology and the outcomes of these vaccines, good or bad. The good news is at least from the scientific literature that I have seen so far, there's very little. That's one of the arguments that people use against these vaccines. But everything that's coming out so far, it makes these vaccines look amazing. So now, when these vaccines were approved for emergency use, what we knew at the time of approval is that they were approved only to guarantee that if you get infected, it will reduce your likelihood of experiencing those extreme COVID-19 symptoms, which put you in danger at that point. If you experience those extreme symptoms, your life is potentially at risk. And that's what these vaccines were approved for. At the time when they were approved, there was simply not enough data to know, for example, if they actually prevent infection in the first place. There just simply wasn't enough data. Now that we vaccinated millions of people with these vaccines, we know that, yes, indeed, they do reduce the symptoms of infection if you do catch the virus. And now we also know, for example, that they do reduce infection as well. So they actually do stop infection. So that's really good. What I'm still really looking for, what I'm of interest, specifically of interest to me, is what happens inside. That part I still want to see. So that's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm going to find out, scientific information. When we produce these virus proteins and we put them out there inside our body to trigger our immune system, what are the molecular consequences of that? What happens genetically inside those cells that produce these spike proteins? How do we affect genetic use, or how the DNA is used inside those cells? I'd love to know that. And I'm sure these studies will come out, because this is really, really hot topic of investigation. And it will very soon. It's just that, science takes a long time. You don't publish something overnight. It usually takes months of work.
Yeah, and I know that some people are concerned about the speed at which these vaccines were approved and released. I've read a number of articles, and it's made me feel comfortable and confident in how quickly they've come out. Maybe you could touch on why these vaccines for COVID-19 were developed so quickly versus vaccines of the past.
Here's my understanding. Obviously, number one is we pumped tons of money, which means we created an army of scientists to be able to investigate this. And therefore, you can speed up the process that way, because if you can do 30 experiments in parallel as opposed to doing them one after the other, you automatically will speed up the process. But the other reason why the process was faster is because normally when a test drug is approved, it has to go through insanely rigorous process for safety reasons. So it's not just that the test is safe itself. You also have to prove that every single chemical component you purchased everywhere from anyone is also safe, and you have to prove it. So that also takes a lot of resources and time. And if I'm not mistaken, and I could be mistaken, is that this emergency approval allowed to negate that need of proving that every single component you've purchased was indeed safe by you needing to prove that internally in-house. So instead, we're just taking the company proof that they were able to deliver, and you don't need to duplicate that proof. So that also would reduce the certain amount of time. That's at least my understanding as to what is referred to as why it's an emergency use. Because first is, let's develop it, let's make sure it's safe, let's make sure it's working well, we can put it out, and then afterwards we will start investigating that all the components used when purchased from whatever suppliers, that their records, that they're showing us, their proof is indeed accurate. And the reason why is because we need a trade-off. You either want the result fast at the potential risk of safety, or we will be ultra safe and put it out way, way later. And where is that trade-off? And the only way we can rely for protection is either vaccination or natural herd immunity. And they're working in concert. Obviously, people are still being infected. Herd immunity is still growing, but now we're increasing how rapidly we're reaching that level of herd immunity through the vaccination process.
Yeah, and I'd heard those comments or the points that you made, and I'm certainly not a vaccination expert, but just in my readings, I understand the reason that the vaccine was quickly came to market as well was that they had a willing and ready population to test on, which is sometimes difficult, I guess, when you're developing a vaccine, to find a group of people that are willing to be tested. And then to put those people out into the community and be exposed to the virus that they're trying to vaccine against. That was also not difficult for them because it's a global pandemic. It was easy for these people to be administered the test vaccine and to actually go out into the community and be exposed to the virus. So I'd read that those items as well allowed them to get feedback right away on their test subjects. So it wasn't a long process in trying to test people.
That's true. Good point, because when the vaccines were approved, they've done studies on thousands of people. So both Moderna and Pfizer, there were somewhere around between 20 to 30,000 people being tested each in both the placebo and vaccination arm in total. So, and the reason why they were able to accumulate these large numbers of people is what you mentioned, and they did it in multiple geographical areas at the same time.
Maybe, I think just because it's timely and we're talking about vaccines, maybe just comment to the efficacy rates for some of the drugs. I know just in general talk amongst people that you have discussions with every day, you hear people comment on the fact that they're going to wait it out until they get, the drug they consider to be, or the vaccine they consider to have the highest efficacy rate, but yet any coverage at this point is better than waiting out for a higher efficacy rate, I guess. What's your thoughts on that, or do you see that as an issue or a concern?
Well, I also don't think people's fear of vaccines should ever be discredited either, whether it's legitimate or not. So, because let's say it's illegitimate and we have scientific proof that it's all safe, which we don't necessarily. True, in theory, these are supposed to be very transient in existence and therefore potentially remove long-term effects, side effects. But nevertheless, let's pretend we already know this. That means we're not educating people properly. So for me, if people are feeling unsafe, that's legitimate, and that means we need to take a different approach. So weeding out, I think it depends on a target group. Obviously, I don't mind waiting myself. I haven't taken the vaccine. I don't mind waiting because I'm not at the highest risk. But I was sure glad my parents took the vaccine because my parents are aging. They're in that very old bracket that is at the highest risk of dying if they get infected. So now let's pretend there could be some long-term negative effects from vaccination. Let's just pretend that. Then my parents, they will not necessarily have to deal with that because they are entering end-of-life stage versus me, not necessarily. So I could still wait and find out based on see what scientific information is coming out. And there's a lot of unknowns here. So one of the things you mentioned is that we are vaccinating at the same time while people have the possibility of still going out and being infected. That's my understanding is that's not how normally we're supposed to be using vaccines. So normally vaccines are not used during pandemic. The vaccines are used prophylactically to prevent a pandemic, not during a pandemic. So what the consequences of that might be, that might not be known. So, and then one possible consequence is that because you are still infected while you're vaccinating, if the vaccine does not kill the virus effectively right away, you run the risk of being able for the virus to mutate itself to a new and more dangerous forms. Indeed, we're suddenly seeing massive number of these new variants that are more dangerous, they're more infectious, they're more deadly. while in the process we were vaccinating. So could that be the consequence? Could they be tied one to the other? I don't know. I just don't know enough from scientific literature whether whether to discredit that hypothesis or not. I'm searching for more information. I am very happy to see how effective they do appear right now. And there's data been published from Israel, UK, and now just about a week ago or so, maybe 2 weeks ago, from CDC, US CDC, and it just looks phenomenal. These vaccines are very effective.
That's great. Good news.
Yeah, really good news for sure.
Yeah,
so now let's just hope there's no long-term side effects that we need to worry about. And
no kidding.
One thing for sure is it's almost unheard of to die from vaccine, or at least the way we're collecting information. Some people might argue that, but it seems very unlikely to ever die from vaccine. But if you do get infected with this virus, depending on your morbidity or basically your age is the biggest risk factor, you can easily die from the infection.
Right. So whichever one's most risky, I mean,
that's right.
Which would you prefer to expose yourself to? Yeah.
But there's other options. Apart from vaccination, we could do mass screening constantly. So that's another option. And I think both should be available in order to accommodate the people who do not want to be vaccinated for whatever their personal reasons are, which should not be discredited to me personally, because it's just not necessarily would be right to start dividing our society into those who are now eligible to participate in one activity versus not, based on the fact that they are afraid of something, and they need other alternatives. And another alternative is to be able to have, instead of you showing a vaccination passport, and by the way, if you get vaccinated, that doesn't guarantee you are protected from infection. It does have a very high likelihood of protecting you, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will protect you. And even in some rare circumstances, it can even increase your likelihood of being infected, although under very rare circumstances. So like vaccine is just not like a one shot and you're done. So being able to test yourself, whether you're infected or not, would be another option. And that's exactly what I'm also working on with another startup company, a very ultra rapid screening test. So hence my background I have a fairly good background in the virus. I read a lot of science on this because of my scientific involvement in a startup company. Okay,
well, that's kind of, I think, the bulk of our questions for you, Dr. Raszek. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. It was an amazing pleasure for me. Obviously, whenever I get to talk about DNA testing, I love it. So thank you for that opportunity.
Well, there's lots more questions. We might have to get you back sometime.
Yeah.
In that case, till next time.
Thanks for tuning in to us at Smokin Bulls, the podcast about business, money, and lifestyle. We had a great conversation with Dr. Mikolaj Raszek today. You can find out more information about us at smokingbulls.com or follow us on our social media.